Lecture 16. The Protestant Reformation. Corruption within the Catholic Church during the Renaissance led many to advocate reform. Some advocating reform, such as Erasmus, urged the Catholic Church leaders to study the more ideal early Christian era to reform the Church according to that time, while keeping legitimate development intact. Others, though, instead of advocating a reform, proposed replacing the entire Renaissance ecclesial system, which they deemed completely corrupt. Those who tended in the direction of revolt were called Protestants, from the Latin verb protestare, meaning to object. Martin Luther is often deemed as the first Protestant who lit the spark that divided Christianity into Catholics and Protestants. Martin Luther's revolt from the Catholic Church was prepared by two priests referred to as Proto-Protestants. These two priests were John Wycliffe from England and John Huss from Czechoslovakia. We will first briefly focus on Wycliffe and Huss before turning our attention to the following Protestant leaders: Martin Luther, Huldrych Zwingli, John Calvin, and Henry VIII. Proto-Protestants: John Wycliffe and John Huss. John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe lived from 1330 to 1384. He is considered a proto-Protestant since he was a forerunner or first person who directly prepared for Martin Luther and the consequent divisions within Christianity that resulted. For this reason, he is sometimes referred to as the morning star of the Reformation. Wycliffe was ordained a priest on September 24, 1351. Shortly after successfully completing a master's degree at Balliol College, in 1361 he was assigned as a parish priest in Fillingham, Lincolnshire. After ministering in several parishes, he once again returned to studying theology in 1363 at Oxford. In 1372 he received his doctorate degree in theology. During the time of Wycliffe's studies, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Islip, appointed Wycliffe warden of the recently founded Canterbury College at Oxford. Wycliffe began to become increasingly opposed to the church hierarchy, of which he was a member of. In an attempt to reduce the role of the priesthood that he deemed overly exalted, he translated St. Jerome's Bible into English, advocated a form of Donatism that locates the validity of a sacrament in the holiness of the minister, denied that the bread and wine used in Catholic masses become the body and blood of Christ, and argued that the church should give up all its property. His radical views inspired an anti-clerical movement called the Lollards. Upon hearing of Wycliffe's teachings, Pope Gregory XI issued 5 bulls in 1377. In one he wrote this, and I quote, "Recently, with great bitterness of here we have learned from the report of many trustworthy persons that John of Wycliffe, rector of the Church of Lutterworth of the Diocese of Lincoln, a professor of Holy Writ, would that he was not a master of error, has burst forth in such execrable and abominable folly, that he does not fear to maintain dogmatically in said kingdom, and publicly to preach, or rather to vomit forth from the poisonous confines of his own breast, some propositions and conclusions, which threaten to subvert and weaken the condition of the entire church." Shortly after his death, during the Council of Constance, Wycliffe was condemned as a heretic. The same council also denounced Wycliffe's Bohemian or Czech follower John Huss and had him burned at the stake, an action that St. John Paul II the Great later apologized for. John Huss. John Huss lived from 1369 to 1415. Along with Wycliffe, John Huss may be considered the second proto-Protestant. He was a Catholic priest from the Kingdom of Bohemia, also known as the Czech Kingdom. According to some historians, Huss was condemned at the Council of Constance not so much for what he taught, but rather for his refusal to condemn teaching associated with Wycliffe. Others disagree. The council also asserted that Huss, along with Wycliffe, was condemned at the council not simply because of his admiration of Wycliffe, but also because of heretical teachings Huss espoused. After carefully examining the condemnation of John Huss, the medieval historian Thomas A. Fudge concludes, I quote, "I believe that evidence shows conclusively that Jan Hus was a heretic. I am also convinced that a careful investigation of canon law and medieval criminal procedure demonstrates that despite identifiable irregularities, the trial was legal. Even some of the most strident critics of the trial concede that the process conformed to current court practices." Pope St. John Paul II's omission of rehabilitating John Huss during the 1999 International Symposium on John Huss, although he did deeply apologize for the church's officials to condemn Huss to be burned at the stake, indicates that he concurs with Fudge. Similarly, according to the documents of the Council of Constance, this Holy Synod therefore pronounces the said John Huss, on account of the aforesaid and many other matters, to have been a heretic, and adjudges him to be considered and condemned as a heretic. After formally denouncing Huss and relinquishing him to the judgment of the secular authority, the Council then lists 30 articles of John Huss that are heretical. A few of the condemned views of Huss are as follows: Jesus never appointed Peter head of the Catholic Church, and therefore the papacy is not divinely instituted. The sins of priests and bishops affects the validity of sacraments. Priests or bishops are in mortal sin, are no longer priests and bishops, and priests who are excommunicated may lawfully disobey this order by preaching. St. John Paul II apologized at an international symposium on John Huss, and I'd like to read that to you. Today, on the eve of the Great Jubilee, I feel the need to express deep regret for the cruel death inflicted on John Huss, and for the consequent wound of conflict and division which was thus imposed on the minds and hearts of the Bohemian people. It was during my first visit to Prague that I declared my hope that precisely in your land decisive steps could be taken on the path of reconciliation and true unity in Christ. The wounds of past centuries must be healed through a new attitude and completely renewed relationships. May our Lord Jesus Christ, who is our peace and has broken down the dividing wall of hostility, guide the path of your people's history towards the rediscovered unity of all Christians, which we ardently hope for in the millennium that is about to begin. Martin Luther sparks Protestantism. Why did Martin Luther's actions, and not Wycliffe's and Huss's, spark a revolt within the Catholic Church that led to the formation of Protestantism? The answer to this question lies in the proximate and immediate historical context that Luther was born into. These include, but are not limited to, the following 6 factors: the Western Schism, the Islamic threat, papal corruption, the appearance of selling indulgences, the invention of the printing press, and the marked desire of German political rulers for power and property. The Western Papal Schism. For details on the Western Papal Schism, where at one point 3 men with considerable followers were all claiming to be pope, will be revisited in the preceding chapter. This schism severely damaged the respect and credibility of the Church. If even the leaders at the top are breaking church unity, why, thought many, can we not do the same? According to the great Catholic English historian Hilaire Belloc, another principal reason that Catholicism became divided into Catholics and Protestants during the 1500s was that the Holy Roman Emperor was devoting precious time and resources to resisting Islamic advances, while paying less attention to maintain peace within his empire. The German princes and other nobles wanted to wrest power away from the emperor, took advantage of the situation by choosing to rebel, supporting Martin Luther, and by promoting Protestantism. 2 examples of Islamic expansion in the 1500s by the Ottoman Empire are the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, involving the Knights Hospitaller on the island of Malta, and the 1571 October 7th Battle of Lepanto, near the western coast of Greece involving the Catholic Holy League. In both cases, despite overwhelming odds, the Ottoman Empire's aggression was repelled. Although these battles took place after the Protestant movement had already gained significant momentum, they still illustrate the continual pushing forward of the Ottoman Empire into Western lands. If the Islamic forces had been victorious during the latter battle, it is likely that they would have eventually been able to rule all Western Europe. As the director of the Prince Al-Walid Center of Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, John L. Esposito states, and I quote, "From the 15th to the 17th century, Ottoman forces seem invincible to European Christians. Yet, the Ottoman naval defeat at Lepanto in 1571 was a turning point, hailed as a victor of Christian Europe over the Muslim Turks." The Pope at the time, the Dominican Saint Pius V, attributed the Catholic victory at the Battle of Lepanto to the praying of the Rosary, specifically by the Roman confraternity who prayed in St. Mary's Basilica that the Catholic forces would prevail over the Ottoman. The date of October 7th is our current liturgical feast day of the Holy Rosary, was chosen because the battle was won on October 7th, 1571. A few years prior to this decisive victory, St. Pius V, in his 1569 papal bull Conserverunt Romani, established the basic form of the Rosary that so many of us now pray. The Gutenberg printing press. A third major factor that enabled the Protestant movement to gain headway was the 1440s invention by the German Johannes Gutenberg of a printing press with metal movable type that could be quickly changed. Martin Luther and his followers used this technological advance to disseminate their views with a speed that was never before possible. The Protestants used the printing press significantly more than Catholics did. According to Cameron A. Mackenzie, and I quote, "If Luther is compared to his Catholic counterparts, the contrast is even more amazing. From 1518 to 1544, less than 2 years after his death, Luther's German publications, not counting Bible translations, number 25,551 printings and reprintings. During the same period, the German works of all the Catholic publicists number only 514 printings. In other words, Luther alone outnumbered them by almost 5-1. Mark U. Edwards, a well-known historian of the Reformation, estimates that over the course of Luther's entire lifetime, over 3 million copies of Luther's German works appeared in print, compared to only 600,000 of his Catholic opponents. And none of these statistics include Luther's German Bible, which was by far his most popular publication. Indulgences. By the early 1500s, the Dominican friar John Tetzel was sent to German lands by Pope Leo X to preach on indulgences. An indulgence, and I quote, "is a remission before God of the temporal punishment due to sins whose guilt has already been forgiven." Money donated by the people for indulgences was used by the Pope to reconstruct Rome's Basilica of St. Peter's. No set fee was required to be granted an indulgence. People were only required to donate according to their ability. Unfortunately, Tetzel's preaching on indulgences was erroneously interpreted by Martin Luther as claiming, "So soon as the penny jingles into the money box, the soul flies out of purgatory." This phrase appears in Martin Luther's 95 Theses that he tapped up on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg in 1517. In defending Tetzel's orthodox preaching of indulgences, the early 20th century German Catholic historian Ludwig Pastor, well known for his history of the Pope, asserts this, I quote, "As regards indulgences for the living, Tetzel always taught pure doctrine. The assertion that he put forward indulgences as being not only a remission of temporal punishment of sin, but as a remission of its guilt, is as unfounded as that other accusation against him that he sold the forgiveness of sins for money, without even any mention of contrition and confession, or that, for payment, be absolved from sins which might be committed in the future. His teaching was in fact very definite, and quite in harmony with the theology of the Church, as it was then, is now, that indulgences apply only to the temporal punishment due to sins which have already been repented of and confessed. Some corrupt Renaissance popes. As briefly discussed in the last lecture, the lives of many Renaissance popes were not exemplary. Popes living at and around the time of Luther were guilty of nepotism, poor financial management, and for breaking their vow of chastity. Perhaps, if all the Renaissance popes were instead saintly men, the Protestant revolt would never have happened. However, it is important to recognize that the corrupt lives of some of the popes is only one factor among others that together help to formally divide the Church. Desire of German princes and nobles for political power, money, and property. The Protestant revolt was not only motivated for religious reasons, but was also propelled by political motives. When this is recognized, then Martin Luther is not simply understood as a religious reformer, but also as a German patriot who opposed the political power and influence held by both the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. Luther's local Lord Elector Frederick of Saxony also held Luther's patriotic views and served as Luther's protector when Luther was summoned to the 1521 Diet of Worms held in Worms, Germany. There, Luther, backed by some of his lords and other German nobles, defended his position before the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who regarded Luther as a heretic. Luther's position was especially attractive to the nobles, since in his 1520 address to the German nobility, he demanded that payments by the nobles to Rome end. Although publicly acknowledging that Luther was a heretic, Charles V was also keenly aware of the political dangers associated with opposing Luther, as Wycliffe and Huss were in the recent past by Catholic leaders. To avoid civil war within his realm, Charles V then prudently, or at least he thought he was being prudent, did not stop Luther and the movement that Luther was promoting. 95 Theses. Contrary to popular belief, the 1517 posting of 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church of Wittenberg was not necessarily an act of rebellion against the Catholic Church. Such a posting, possibly done by either Martin Luther or by one of his students, was an ordinary act that professors at the University of Wittenberg, where Luther taught at, did in order to formally engage people in a theological discussion. When considered together with the other factors presented, the posting of the 95 Theses was only a symbolic tiny spark that lit the fire of the Protestant revolt against the Catholic Church. A few details about Martin Luther and his beliefs. Rejection of the Catholic Church. Luther's rejection of the Catholic Church is evident in his 1518 letter to his former teacher, Dr. Jodocus Trutvetter, and in his response to Henry VIII when countering Henry VIII's defense of the Seven Sacraments, most likely written by St. Thomas More. And this is what Luther writes to Trutvetter. To explain myself further, I simply believe that it is impossible to reform the Church unless the canon law, scholastic theology, philosophy, and logic, as they are now taught, are thoroughly rooted out and other studies put in their stead. I am so fixed in this opinion that I daily ask the Lord, as far now may be, that the pure study of the Bible and the Fathers may be restored. You think I'm no logician. Perhaps I'm not, but I know that I fear no one's logic when I defend this opinion. And this is an excerpt from Luther writing to Henry VIII. Moreover, unless I am greatly mistaken, if this sacrament, the holy orders, and this fiction ever falls to the ground, the papacy with its characters will scarcely survive. Then our joyous liberty will be restored to us. We shall realize that we are all equal by every right. Having cast off the yoke of tyranny, we shall know that he who is a Christian has Christ, that he who has Christ has all things that are Christ, and can do all things. Of this I'll write more, 211 and more vigorously, as soon as I perceive that the above has displeased my friends the Papists. Rejection of the Jewish people. In 1543, Martin Luther also wrote pointedly against the Jewish people in his On the Jews and Their Lies. And here are just a few excerpts where he commands the German nobles to persecute the Jewish people. I brief, dear princes and lord, those of you who have Jews under your rule, if my counsel does not please you find better advice, so that you and we all can be rid of the unbearable, devilish burden of the Jews. Do not grant them protection, safe conduct, or communion with us, nor dare we make ourselves partners in their devilish rantings and ravings by shielding and protecting them, by giving them food, drink, and shelter, or by other neighborly. And later, he even states this: first, to set fire to the synagogues or schools, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn. He continues and continues. It's hard for me to read his excerpts where he commands the German nobles to persecute the Jewish people, but I've included them in the transcript. Hitler in his Mein Kampf refers to Luther, along with Frederick the Great and Richard Wagner, as one of history's great men. Hitler's reference to Luther may raise the question as to what extent did Luther's anti-Semitism help to prepare for the much later Nazi anti-Semitism? Were Luther's writings intentionally and explicitly followed by Hitler, Göring, and Himmler during World War II, as William Shirer boldly argues in his popular book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich? Did Luther intend for something like the terrible World War II Holocaust, the Shoah, of the Jewish people to occur? I do not subscribe to Shirer's Luther to Hitler thesis. Due to the complexity of history, it cannot be reasonably demonstrated that a person's writings directly caused the decisions of another person who lived 400 years later from the first person. With that said, we do influence future events, even ones hundreds of years ahead of us. To what extent this is the case, though, will always remain unclear. Interestingly, the Nazis won a larger share of the vote in Protestant than in Catholic areas of Germany in elections from 1928 to 1932. In addition, capitalizing on many German people, respect for Martin Luther, the Nazis on November 9, 1938, the eve of Martin Luther's birthday, through November 10th, the day of Martin Luther's birthday, killed Jews and vandalized Jewish shops. This event is infamously referred to as Kristallnacht, as the Night of Broken Glass. Key beliefs of Martin Luther. The beliefs that Martin Luther promoted are succinctly presented in the Lutheran Confession of Faith called the Augsburg Confession, written in 1530 at the Diet of Augsburg. The following sampling of Lutheran beliefs comes from the Augsburg Confession's 28 articles. Number 1. The substance of the Eucharistic bread and wine is not changed in the sense of transubstantiation into the body and blood of Christ, but rather both the reality of Christ and the reality of the bread are fully present. According to Lutheran theology, what occurs is a consubstantiation by which Christ adheres in, with, and under the bread and wine. 2. A Christian cannot merit anything. One is justified only by faith and not according to the Catholic sense of fides caritate formata, or faith formed by charity. According to Catholic belief, even an action as simple as donating money to the church for an indulgence or for another charitable end can, with right intention, form one's faith. 3. It is lawful for clergy, monks, and nuns to marry. Luther set the example by marrying Katharina von Bora, a former Cistercian nun. 5. In contrast with Catholic belief, for Lutherans, the celebration of the Mass does not have a sacrificial element. Instead, the Mass only is centered on worship, praise, and thanksgiving. And 6. Every Christian is a confessor. Going to confession to a Lutheran pastor, which is encouraged, is essentially no different from going to confession to a member of the congregation. Huldrych Zwingli. Zwingli, like Luther, was also formally a Catholic priest. At the same time that Luther was dissenting from Catholic teaching in German lands, Zwingli was resisting church authority in his native land of Switzerland. His highly symbolic break occurred during Lent in March of 1522. His actions that day are dubbed the Fair of the Sausages. This day can be considered as marking the beginning of Switzerland's Protestant movement. On that day, some of Zwingli's followers, with Zwingli's approval, publicly ate sausages even though eating of any meat was forbidden by Catholic Lenten regulations. Zwingli defended these rebellious actions in a sermon he published the following month called Regarding the Choice and Freedom of Foods. According to him, eating sausages during Lent is permitted since faith and not good works save one. On this point and others, such as his approval of clerical marriages, he agreed with Luther. He even went so far as to encourage the dissolution of monasteries and use the money obtained from the monasteries to build schools, help orphanages, and poor houses. However, on another doctrinal position, he disagreed significantly from Luther and likewise from Catholicism. As noted, Luther believed that the wine and bread used in the Mass become the body and blood of Christ, but under and along with the reality of the wine and the bread. Zwingli went one step further. He taught that the wine and bread used during Eucharistic celebration only symbolize the body of Christ. John Calvin. After Zwingli was killed in a battle between various Swiss regions, the Frenchman and former Catholic John Calvin, who had moved to Geneva, became the leader of the Protestant movement. There, in 1536, Calvin published his Institutes of the Christian Religion. This work helped to institutionalize, in other words, organize the Protestant movement that Martin Luther had inspired. Calvin's doctrinal teaching is often represented by the simple acronym TULIP. This summary of Calvin's theology was not formalized by him, but rather by the Calvinist Synod of Dort in 1619. Nonetheless, TULIP is commonly accepted as accurately representing Calvinism. And the following is our explanation of the acronym. T stands for total depravity. This means, according to Calvinism, our human condition is totally depraved, not simply wounded by original and personal sin as Catholicism teaching. U stands for unconditional election. According to Calvinism, God preordained some people to be saved. Their salvation does not in any way depend on what they do in their lives. L stands for limited atonement. This means that Christ only died for his elect, not for all mankind. In contrast, Catholicism holds, as clearly stated by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, God predestines no one to go to hell. Similarly, St. John Paul II asserted, salvation is offered to all. I stands for irresistible grace. Those who are part of God's elect irresistibly follow grace. Since their cooperation with, or in a sense coercion by, grace is not in any way due to their efforts, they cannot merit God's grace. P stands for persistence in grace. Once a person is elected, he will automatically and persistently follow the promptings of God's saving grace. King Henry VIII. While Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin were promoting Protestantism, Henry VIII was beginning a schism that would later develop into another version of Protestantism. Do you recall when we were discussing details concerning Luther, reference was made to Henry VIII's defense of the seven sacraments? In this document, probably written by St. Thomas More, Henry VIII defended Orthodox Catholic teaching against Protestant doctrine. Henry VIII dedicated this vigorous Catholic defense to the reigning Pope Leo X. In recognition of Henry VIII's orthodoxy, Henry was awarded by the Church the title Defender of the Faith. He lost the title, though, after he broke from the Church out of anger for not receiving a marriage annulment from the Pope. In the 1520s, Henry VIII requested that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, be annulled. One reason he wanted an annulment was because Catherine had not given birth to a son who would succeed his father. Henry VIII's arguments was that his wife Catherine had previously been married for about 5 months to his deceased brother Arthur, who died of consumption in 1502. The Pope, though, refused to grant to Henry VIII an annulment. This refusal so enraged Henry VIII that in disobedience to the Pope he divorced Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. Then, in 1534, Henry VIII went one step further by declaring himself in the Supremacy Act head of the Catholic Church in England. Upon doing so, he and his followers went into schism. Thomas Cromwell, who in 1532 was appointed Henry VIII's chief minister, then instituted a nationwide persecution of Catholics, which included the removal and dismantling of Catholic statues and images, including from the shrine to St. Thomas Becket, and dissolving Catholic monasteries. St. Thomas More and Bishop St. John Fisher are two notable saints who refused to sign the Supremacy Act and were martyred as a result. Even though faithful Catholics were being persecuted throughout England, the church that Henry VIII had made himself the head of was not a form of Protestantism, since it still held onto Catholic belief and teaching. Not until Henry VIII's son Edward VI, whose mother was Jane Seymour, did the Church of England, under the direction of the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, shift from being a schismatic church to a Protestant church, complete with non-Catholic doctrine. For this reason, Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical Apostolicae Curae traced back the invalidity of Anglican ordinations to the time of Edward's reign. God bless.